Scott, why is chess the best board game superior to everything else?
Because it's different every time you play it. No matter which opening is your favorite, you have no idea what your opponent will do. There's always something to learn. I think it's fascinating, the different styles of play. So every time you play a different person. Even if you're playing the same individual again, like their style of play is going to be different. Sometimes they're playing an aggressive opening. Sometimes they're playing a cagey opening. And it's just awesome. It's awesome. I loved having to be forced to think 3 and 4 moves ahead of time. If I do this, what are the ramifications? What are the repercussions if I don't do that? So yeah, it's the best. It's the best.
I would totally agree. There was a time I was addicted for over a year. I've kind of backed off. What's your ELO?
1,000.
Okay. You're better. I was about 800 in my prime.
What was your time control?
Like what constraint did I play? 10 to 30 mainly. Yeah. But I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It feels like you're playing like a game through time. Like so many people throughout history have played this game. Yes. And so it feels like you're, I don't know, embedded with the past. I don't know how to explain it.
Well, and they can pull up like, hey, this game is reminiscent of a game played between 2 guys in 1725 via like they would mail like their moves to correspondence chess. And then you talk about the time controls. It's a completely different feel when you're playing 5-minute versus 30-minute. Like everything's so different. So I had no idea.
I can't do blitz. I don't know what it is about it. I am not good at it. I figured my brain would work fast. Like my brain usually works pretty fast. For chess, I cannot. I think it's like 300 or 400. I can't get it up.
Yeah. I like my favorite time control is 5+2. So it's 5-minute, and every time you make a move, you get 2-second bonus. And I can usually blitz out my openings really quickly. And so, yeah. Anyway, I had no idea.
So the reason I'm having you on is probably something that's pretty special to me. But you're in the church planting world, which what a time to be in the church planting world. You're in. You're still in the Bible Belt. Your Providence would be Indiana, right? Do you do anything in Kentucky or the bordering?
No, Indianapolis and surrounding counties mostly.
Okay, and so you're still a little bit in the Bible Belt, so it might not be as like outright persecution or aggression, but church planting in a world that even the most, I would say, conservative Bible Belt states are becoming more and more non-Christian. I heard someone say it recently, but we're in what's almost called a pre-Christian age, where we're like almost before the apostles. Like not many people even know about Jesus anymore. Like we used to be in a state where we knew, like a lot of people at least knew who Jesus was, maybe grew up in the church a little bit. But as we get farther and farther along, even the students that are coming up through college, they don't even know the story of Jesus. And so you're in a church planting world that is just probably much different than people would think. I want to talk to you about what you're seeing on the ground level, what is going on with some of these guys who are thinking about starting churches. If guys are thinking about it, what they should be concerned with or encouraged by, all of that.
Sounds great.
Why did you want to get started in church planting, helping people start churches?
So it actually began for me, mission trip when I was a teenager. I was in the Philippines, felt called to ministry. When I got back, I started interviewing because I was a little bit nerdy, 15, 16 years old. I called pastors and interviewed them. I said, if you knew you were going to go into ministry, what would you have done differently? They said, I wish I had gotten a degree in something marketable. And so I thought, okay, I was very interested in entrepreneurship, business, things like that. So I was going to get a business degree. And worked on with an entrepreneur in Evansville while I was getting my degree, and was introduced to church planting for the first time while I was in college. The church that I grew up in planted a church, and I thought, what a cool marriage of like my business entrepreneurship interests and training and ministry. Like, what would it look like if those two things merged together? And so from a really young age, as a college kid, we got involved with our very first church plant. And our pastor lovingly kind of kicked me out of the nest and told me like, hey man, it's obvious God's called you to ministry. You really ought to go prepare. And so at literally every stop from the time I was 18 years old, we have been directly involved in church planting. And so I've always known that this is what I wanted to do. In the role that I'm in now specifically, I kind of always said I wanted to be Barnabas when I grew up. Like, I want to be an encourager. One of the things about Barnabas that I think is so interesting is Barnabas is known as the son of encouragement, right? Everybody knows that aspect of Barnabas, but Barnabas was also a goer. Like, he went with Paul. He fought for John Mark. Like, Paul was done with John Mark, and Barnabas wasn't. And he grabbed John Mark, and by the end of Paul's life, Paul's like, would you please send him to me? He's useful to me. And so as I watched kind of this survey surveyed the church planting landscape, I was like, there's not a lot of Barnabases out there who are like actively participating in the doing of church planting while at the same time trying to be an encouragement. And it just so happened that there was a role that was developed that gave me the opportunity to do both of those things. So
this is an interesting question, and I want to be careful with it. But how much do you think the modern church is set up like a business? And do you think there are helpful aspects to to a man learning business when developing his church or thinking about ministry? And if he takes a position, where does business play a role in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are functional requirements in order to own and operate at a corporation of any kind, right, in our country. And so to have at least some familiarity with the laws, building and construction, accounting, and all those kinds of things, it helps you as a pastor. Number one, you're relatable to your people because they're all working or likely working in some form, fashion, or function in business. But it also helps you to be familiar with and aware of what's happening around you as an organization. Where it goes sideways is when you begin to allow the business world to inform your ecclesiology. Like, those are not the same thing. It happens honestly. Like, we think as Americans we're very proud of democracy. Well, we overemphasize a democratic thinking into our ecclesiology when it may or may not actually be present. And the same thing can happen with business practices. There's a lot of really helpful business practices that you can incorporate in the life of the church. But if you overemphasize those, you can go sideways really quickly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't a Christian through the first half of my college career, but I studied business. And as soon as I got into the ministry kind of aspect of it, I was like, man, I don't know how much it's supposed to work like this, but as soon as I got back into the ministry side of it, I was like, this looks a lot like a business. The way that we've set up like kind of directors or different positions inside the business, the structures, the meetings, accounting, all that stuff. I realized my business degree, marketing, social media now more and more, I recognized my business classes were playing more and more of a role into what my life looked like in the church than I ever expected. And I didn't know. And I asked my pastor one time, I was like, is it okay to think of the church as very similar to a business structure? And he kind of got upset with me. And I was like, I didn't know, like, I get why, because it shouldn't look as much like it, but it does. And I found my business like degree helping me quite a bit in the church.
Yeah, I heard a guy a long time ago who I would not commend to you today, but he used to say, when it comes to culture, you can reject, receive, or redeem it. And there's a lot of things about the business world that you can redeem that would be incredibly useful in the life of the church. And I think to ignore the things that are useful and helpful is actually foolish. And so, yeah, the danger, like in so many things, is just an overemphasis or an over-reliance upon business practices. At the end of the day, one of the key distinctions that makes the church is that it's the Spirit, right? Like the Holy Spirit and the way the Holy Spirit functions, it's not always going to be the same way that it would function in the life of a business.
And yeah, I do think I've heard many pastors say that maybe going to seminary, maybe doing some type of Bible work, but it's very, very helpful to study something else in undergrad specifically. Maybe like throughout your high school career, like you could take Bible classes. Getting acclimated with how to teach the word is very, like, obviously if you're going into ministry, but picking other skills besides just studying the Bible, because it won't be as helpful to your congregation.
you never know where you might be called to serve. There may be seasons in your life in ministry where you need to work in the marketplace doing something. And, if you have a degree in Bible, that's fine, but it's going to limit the kinds of jobs you're able to get. And then I think secondarily, like it helps you to relate to your people. Like I used to work in banking. And so I can sit down and have a conversation with members of our congregation. And I remember all too well, like what it was like to work in banking and try to manage volunteering in my church and being a present husband and all the things that come along with that. And it just makes you relatable. So
what would you say is some of the more helpful pastors when coming to church planting, how they kind of maybe orient their life before actually taking on a church?
Yeah, I think at times one of the dangers that I find with church planters who went to Bible college, went to seminary, they were a youth pastor for a season, and now they're going to go plant their first church, is sometimes they have not, I don't know if I'm going to be careful how I say this. They haven't encountered a lot of real life. They haven't felt a lot of the pressures that their congregants will feel. And so I would tend to say the church planters that are at times most effective, not entirely, but often, they either have a background in the marketplace or they're older. Those two things tend to coincide pretty regularly. One of the things that I find honestly really encouraging right now is the number of our church planters that are coming out of the marketplace. We had a guy that was selling diesel farm equipment, and he's planting in a rural context. Made him super relatable to the people that he was ministering to. Have another guy that was a strength and conditioning coach. And it's funny because each of those guys, when they come out of the marketplace, they bring their experiences from the marketplace into their strategy, whether they realize it or not. The guy that does the strength and conditioning stuff, like when you talk to him about his metrics and plans for how to make a disciple, you can tell he's a strength and conditioning coach. It's like, okay, here's the process, here's the programming, right? Because that's the language that he speaks. But you know who he's really effectively witnessing to right now? It's a bunch of college or a bunch of athletes, a bunch of high school athletes and coaches. So I think it's a tremendous advantage.
Would you recommend seminary?
Yeah, I think so. Now, what that seminary might look like, that experience might look like, is going to be different for different guys. Some guys are going to be doing seminary while they're also doing some form of ministry or something else. I do think that there is a lot to learn. And I think if you're left to yourself to determine what you're going to learn, there are some dangers to that. And so I think seminary is a benefit. It's a lot like the conversation we had about can you bring the business into the church? Seminary has dangers too. I mean, you have guys that live in the seminary bubble, and man, they can fight you tooth and nail about fine points of ecclesiology and theology and all these things, but they can't sit down with a grieving widow. They can't relate to the barista in a way that is meaningful. They can't coach T-ball and do it with the eyes of a missionary. They can't do that because they've just spent all of their time focusing on these minute points of theology or ecclesiology. So I think most of life, certainly in church planting as well, is recognizing the two ditches and not staying in one or the other. And so if you're prone to academia and, man, that's just your bent, I would caution you not to lean so heavily into that you become unrelatable. If you think that seminary and education is worthless and not worth your time, I would tend to encourage you, you don't know nearly what you think you know. And you're going to be challenged with a whole lot of things that you're going to be utterly unprepared for. So yeah, that's a long way to say, I think seminary is very valuable.
Being in that bubble for 3 years, I couldn't have explained it better. Everything you said was just like right on the nail. I remember coming back from seminary, and like I said, I was saved later on in my life, and like the love for Jesus was so just on fire for like the first couple of years that I was saved. It, like that honeymoon season, but I was just so in love with Jesus. I just it was like a first taste of water. I couldn't stop. And I remember coming back from seminary and my dad looking at me, and he said, that love that you have for Jesus is gone. He's like, you have a lot of knowledge, but that love and passion, like of genuinely caring about people, he's like, I don't feel it on you anymore. He's like, and I was probably in one of the darker places I had been since I became a Christian after seminary. And it was just, yeah, it rocked me. It was like I'm not acting or talking or have the presence of Jesus, but I have all this knowledge. And I let the seminary and I heard about it. I heard about like this could happen, and I fell right into the ditch. And I thought there were a lot of amazing things about it. Like the things that I learned are still going now that I've kind of came back. All those things that I learned are more practically in my heart, and I figured out how to use them better. And so I don't know how to approach seminary in a better way.
I would commend to guys. So I think you and I went to the same seminary, and most seminarians gravitate to like one of four churches. And I think part of what creates the seminary bubble is when you attend a church where every volunteer is a seminary student. Anytime there's a mission trip, it's a bunch of seminary students. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of churches in that same city that run 75 people that give anything to have a group of 3 or 4 seminarians come and partner with them for 4 years. One of the things that really blessed and encouraged me specifically, I feel like I avoided most of the seminary bubble, grace of God and the way that I'm wiring. But I served at a little First Baptist church across the river, and I got to see up close and personal, like what I'm learning, how does it immediately apply? And what are things that are, it's good to know these things, but this isn't something that most of our people are wrestling with or contending with. I remember I would sit in classes and guys would spout off about something in a class. I'd be like, you've never sat in a deacons meeting with guys who have t-shirts that are older than you. If you say that in your first church, you're not going to be there for very long. So, but I did. I mean, I sat in deacons meetings with guys who had t-shirts that were older than me. And I learned a lot about the value of being quiet and observing and learning and how to affect change that isn't maybe as fast as I wanted to affect change, but would actually create a lasting change. So yeah, seminary is valuable, but you have to be wise, I think, about how you go about it.
People need to be a little bit more outspoken about how to take on seminary well, because I watched so many men come out with around the same experience that I had. And a lot of people talk about it as this extremely dry season. And it's like you're learning about like the most amazing thing in the world, preparing for maybe the highest calling, which it's kind of crazy how many people don't actually go into ministry or get out like very quickly. But it's maybe the highest calling. And there's definitely like a miscommunication about what seminary should be, what seminary is, how to take on that experience. I think a lot of people like take it in their head and then it comes right out of their mouth. I think what you were explaining is you got to watch it go to the heart, kind of filter through the heart of like, how do I actually help people? And then it comes back out through the mouth. But if it goes straight from here to here, you're done. You're not going to last in ministry. I remember I was in a class one time, and this amazing scholar has wrote so many books, traveled the world, and a guy gets up and asks a question. And he goes on this, like, I don't know, 5-minute monologue with like, I've never heard most of the words that he said. And the professor just looks at him and he's like, I don't even think you have any idea what you just asked. And that was helpful to no one. You wasted all of our time. I'm going to keep going.
It's like a straight up Billy Madison moment.
Exactly. And I was just like, man, these guys take themselves too seriously. Like it's not that big of a deal. But no, and I think in my dream world would be probably to move it back towards the local church or local communities of learning and building up each other, learning how to preach, hopefully having a couple guys who can stand up and teach the Bible. I think one of the things coming out of seminary that I've noticed is taking people out of their communities and putting them in a completely different community for 4 years, expecting them to come right back and start a church or like get back on ministry or to even desire to come back. When most of them go, they leave their communities, they start their whole new life here. They're really plugged in. They maybe get married, have a couple kids, and barely ever go back to their actual, like the community that they had a burden for. And so I think hopefully there's a way that we're going to be able to build seminaries into local churches or into local communities where guys can stay a little bit closer connected to where God has like put that rock in their shoe. Does that make sense? Yeah. Have you ever thought about that?
And I think that that's a growing thing, partially because of the mass availability of distance education, things like that. But you're seeing like smaller seminaries spring up. Like Indianapolis has ITS that has sprung up in the last couple of years. And now you kind of look at guys who are from this area and you would say like, why move? Like you can still get a seminary education. You can still belong to the church that you've grown up in or been a part of, where you have community, where people know you and you know them. There's accountability.
That they need a guy like you. Like they don't want to lose a guy like you. You're helpful. Like you're maybe the legacy of the church. What? Sure. Don't leave us. Yeah,
absolutely. And then if you stay, like, man, we could utilize you. We could bring you on staff, or we could recommend you or send you. And we just, I sense that that's growing, but it's still in its infancy in a lot of ways.
Okay. Before we get into maybe what the church looks like right now, and what guys are struggling with, or maybe encouraged by, maybe try to keep it a little bit more light and encouraging. I want to talk about what is the church? What is ecclesia? Like, what did we see really mapped out in the New Testament of what the church should look like now? What is kind of North American Mission Board? What do you, when you're sitting down with a new pastor, what are the like core foundations that you guys talk about of this is the church? Let's maybe start our foundation there.
It's funny. So I was in a seminary class, and one of the questions that we were asked was, what is the irreducible ecclesiological minimum?
Very seminary sentence. Yep.
Very seminary sentence. But it prompted a really interesting debate. Right? Like, so what do you have to have? Do you have to have a building? Well, no, you don't have to have a building. Well, do you have to have pews? Do you have to have music? Do you have to, you start whittling away pretty quickly and you're like, okay, so you don't have to have a lot. You have to have someone who is called by the Lord to pastor. You have to have an identifiable body of some sort. This is this family of faith. Call it whatever you will. They see themselves as a church. They desire to be a church. I mean, we have some of my folks attend a church where they have a Sunday school class with 80 people in it. Well, most of our church plants don't start with 80 people in it. So what's the difference between the Sunday school class my parents attend and the church plant of 40? It's intentionality. The 40 people who are planting a church want to be a church. The Sunday school class doesn't want to be. They would just want to be a Sunday school class. So there's a level of intentionality and ownership. Like we want to be a church. We have an identifiable shepherd. And generally speaking, you would say the ordinances. So the observation of the Lord's Supper, baptism, and then maybe some form or function of elders and deacons. So it's at its base level, you would probably see those things all being expressed in the life of the church. But what that looks like church to church might look a little bit different. The way that they go about baptism, or how often they observe communion, or are all of their elders local, indigenous from within the church, or do you have provisional elders? So even within that definition, there's still flex and movement there a little bit as well.
That's more stripped back than I would have guessed.
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, what do you think would have been added?
Well, I don't know if I would have personally added more. I think just the impression that we get of the American church, if I were to ask someone, I think they would have maybe came up with more. But sure, if I was to like just sit down and really think about what are the core components of like what a church has to be, would you consider prayer as like maybe an ordinance? I don't know. Did you say prayer, like a community of praying together?
I don't know that I would say prayer is necessarily an ordinance, but I do think where you find God's people together, you ought to find your God's people together in prayer, for sure. Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I guess if I would have cut it back, I probably would have given a similar answer. Are guys shocked when you kind of go through what the actual, like how much flexibility they truly have when they're starting their own church?
At times. I think sometimes guys it's a little bit of a breath of fresh air. Like I don't have to have all of those things. Now, having said that, that's at a minimum what you probably need to have from a biblical standpoint. And again, there may be some flex there, some argument there, but let's just go operate on that's biblically what you have to have. Contextually, though, you may need to have other things if you're going to effectively reach the community where you've started. So, for instance, in some communities, a church meeting in a school is not a big deal at all. In other communities, not having your own space would be a big obstacle or a big hurdle. And so contextually, you have to think about not only what is the minimum necessity from a biblical standpoint, but like contextually, if you're starting a new church, you also have to think missionally, like, okay, so what do I also need to have at a minimum to reach this context, to reach this community? Place matters. I read about some missionaries, and they had launched this church and they were doing great. People were coming regularly and they were sitting and listening, but they weren't seeing anybody come to faith. And they just couldn't understand. Everybody's receiving them positively, but nobody's praying to receive Christ. Why is that? And as they pressed into it, they found out that everybody thought these were just stories, like good moral story, Aesop's fables, kinds of things. They're like, if this is all true, why aren't you telling this under the truth tree? And there was a tree where they would hold court. And if you were under the boughs of this tree, you were solemnly swearing that everything you were saying was true. And they said, well, if you were telling us this stuff under the truth tree, we wouldn't have thought this was just moralism. We would have thought that, oh, wow, he really means this. This is the truth. Now, we might not have truth trees in Indianapolis, but you do have to think about, like, what does place communicate and things like that.
What are some unique obstacles in the United States when it comes to church planting?
You often have to convince people that they're lost before they can be found. Now, that's probably beginning to change a little bit as per our conversation earlier. But especially in the Midwest, in the South, Bible Belt, good moral people who will claim a connection to a local church of some sort. And they think, as long as they're a good person who does the right things and present dad and husband, and I'm a good man, I work hard, they think that equates to, well, surely I'm going to heaven. I'm not like that guy over there. I think that's a challenge. I think a lot of times you have to explain to people and convince people that they're not actually converted. They don't actually have a relationship with Jesus. There's a difference between beholding Jesus and believing in Jesus. I think a lot of people come to be entertained by Jesus. I think you see a lot of churches where the main draw is that, if I can say it this way, it's the entertainment value. People come to be entertained. They want their kids to have fun programming. They want to hear good music. They want to hear a good talk. I mean, and sadly, in a lot of places, there's not a lot of difference between a sermon and a TED Talk. The scriptures are read at the beginning as kind of a jumping off point, and never to be revisited again.
Never been to a sermon like that.
I'm sure you've never seen or heard one like that. And I think that's a challenge. Dealing with, how do you deal appropriately with consumerism? If you ignore it entirely, you're probably not going to reach people. But if you embrace it wholeheartedly, you're going to be converted by the consumerism rather than seeing Christ impact it. So I think that's a challenge. Biblical illiteracy is a big issue. Like, we have a lot of people who they think they know things about the Bible that actually are not true. How many times have we heard statements that are said, well, the Bible says, it's like, actually, that was Ben Franklin. Like, that's not from the Bible. Even people who have gone to church for a long time, like, they just don't know their Bible. Something I have said several times here recently is Christians tend to treat the Bible like a multivitamin rather than a meal to be enjoyed daily. And multivitamin's great. It's fine for its intended purpose. But if all you ever consumed was multivitamin and that's it, you die. And as somebody living in Western culture, if all you consume of faith is what you hear on K-Love on your way to work and little snippets here and there, you're going to be an emaciated Christian. you're not gonna have a vibrant walk with Jesus. So I think that's a significant challenge as well. And yeah, I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on and on.
I'm curious to hear about maybe the discrepancy between the expectations of church planters and, I would say, like, yeah, the expectations of what they think they're going to accomplish maybe in the first 3 years. I would say with the movement of social media, with the movement of these mega churches and all these like explosions of like the Elevations or the Hillsongs or the Transformations or the Life Church, and you just see these mega, like, larger than life pastors, celebrity pastors. And I mean, you just get on Instagram and they do like a sermon snippet and it's 1 million views. And maybe some of these pastors, I'm going to give them grace, but maybe not all of them, but maybe some of them come in thinking like, I'm a pretty good speaker. Like, I'm a handsome guy. I'm charismatic. I've been successful in other industries, in the business world, in the sports world. Like, I could do that in the same way. And I'm going to be able to scale this pretty quickly. I think I can draw a crowd, like, and just off of my own wisdom, I might be able to do this. What would you say are like the common expectations, misconceptions about church planting versus the reality of maybe the first 3 to 5 years?
One of the things I tell every church planter and spouse that I meet is, if you stay with this, you will walk with a limp. That limp might be your health. It might be your finances. It might be your kids. It might be your marriage. I don't know what it will be, but if you stay with this, you will walk with a limp at the end of it. And I don't say that to scare them or to scare anybody off. It's just a reality. You are establishing a gospel outpost in a spiritual war where you will absolutely be attacked. And I think one of the misconceptions is that it's not all that different than opening up a business. You neglect to take into account that this is an act of spiritual warfare, and that you are waging war on those that are condemned to hell apart from Christ, and you are seeking to see them won to saving faith in Jesus. And there is a very real spiritual warfare that is happening. And I don't think guys count the cost. I think one of the big misconceptions is that the cost is far less than it actually is. I think in some ways we've drummed out a bit of the idealism that it's going to be easy. There's been enough. Church planting's been around long enough that guys are recognizing it's not as easy as they might see on social. You do have to combat your own ego. I was the guy you just described. I thought when I went to plant a church, I'm a pretty good speaker, pretty good preacher. We had good music, had a good facility. I thought, what would prevent this thing from exploding in growth? I'm doing all of the right things. Surely it will. And you have to learn to sacrifice your own ego. Every church is going to have its own lane that the Lord entrusts it to run in. And the lane that the Lord had for us to run in was much smaller in scope than I wanted, honestly, because of my own ego. It was a smaller lane to run in, but it was, but we got to send guys into ministry. That was our lane. Like we sent guys into ministry. They came to us typically broken from a previous ministry experience, and we invested in them and sent them out. And so I think one of the misconceptions guys have is that it's a matter of, I get a cool facility, a decent, singer, songwriter, worship leader. I convey compelling messages, and this thing's just going to rapidly grow. And that does happen sometimes, but it's not the norm. I think one of the disservices that has been done in the name of church planting is that we have presented what is not normative as normative. The average guy will plant a church that might get somewhere between 100 and 200. I was meeting with a guy who is super discouraged right now. He's having a really, really hard time. church is not large. The building is not cool. The music is not awesome. He is not particularly compelling as a communicator. They're getting ready to baptize 3 people in a week. And I was like, do you recognize that 3 people's eternal destination has gone from hell to heaven? And like, that's ultimately what this is about, right? Like, we ultimately want to see people come to know, love, and serve King Jesus. So anyway, I say all that to say, like, each guy kind of has his own misconceptions and ideas. One commonality that I would tell you happens every time with every church planter that I think I've ever met is they all say, I just want to plant a small, faithful church where everybody is known and can be known, where we see people come to faith. And I don't care if it's ever very large. I hope it doesn't ever get very large. And they say that until they have to start paying for their own salary out of the tithes and offerings from the church. Or the guy that planted the same time as them down the road sees their church growing rapidly. And all of a sudden now it's kind of like, well, I wouldn't mind if it was a little bit bigger than it is. So it just depends. Like I say, it just depends on the guy. It depends on kind of what his own personal issues are, what his own motivations for planting a church are. I'll tell you this, like with most of our guys, with all of our guys, we'll talk with them about like what led you to this moment. How do you know that you're called to plant a church? We make them write it out with them and if they're married, their spouse. How do you know that you've been called to plant a church? How do you know you've been called to plant this church? They have to write it all out, have to use scripture and kind of walk themselves through it. We make them keep it. And anytime they begin to wrestle or struggle with a particular season of ministry, we tell them, pull it out. Has God called you here? And if the answer to that question is yes, then stay at it.
You talked about ego there, ego and pride, a little bit of expectations on themselves. But you also said somewhere in there, effects on their family and their wife and their marriage potentially. I want you to talk about that. I want you to talk about what things might men not expect when it comes to the detriment it might hit on a marriage, or maybe the expectations of a church, a little growing church that they did not expect, but that you could talk through what family life might look like and how it might hit it, or how the enemy might attack persistently with that part of your family. Because I love that you use the word spiritual warfare. You are entering into like another like you're in like epicenter of where the war is happening. And so it's easier to be on the outskirts a little bit. It's still playing the game. But when you're right in the crosshairs, it's a different thing. And I think maybe as Americans, we don't talk about spiritual warfare.
Yeah, it makes us feel uncomfortable for sure.
And so I want to hear you talk about what does that look like? Maybe how does the devil attack marriage and family?
Yeah, it depends on the guy, it depends on the situation. The common ones that I've seen most frequently, if you allow it, church planting will eat up all of your time, and it sounds very spiritual. Hey, babe, I'm going to be running late. I've got to meet with this guy who I met today, and I gotta take care of that. And then I've got this counseling appointment later. I need to go to do this counseling appointment, and then tomorrow I'm doing this thing, and I've got that meeting. I need to prepare for the sermon, and it all sounds very spiritual, and a lot of it genuinely is. But if you allow it to, it will consume all of your time. And I've seen guys who will invest countless hours investing in the life of their church and 0 hours investing in the life of their family. And they neglect the fact that church, numerous church plants fail and fold. And your church plant might fail and fold. And if it does, what are you coming back to in your family? Your first priority is your family. We tell all of our guys, you cannot plant a healthy church if you do not have a healthy family. And you cannot have a healthy family if you ignore them. And at times there are guys who will allow the busyness of the church and the church plant to trump the needs of his family. And again, it's really easy to couch all of that in very spiritual terms. And so your spouse will have a hard time arguing and saying, well, you're counseling with somebody again. You're discipling that guy one-on-one. They don't want to say that. Nobody wants to be like, how dare you disciple that guy when you're not at home tonight? So ignoring your family is a surefire way to see your family shrivel. I've seen health where a spouse or a child is going through health crisis, and planter feels the tension of caring for a sick family member while also trying to plant this church. And how do you navigate the tensions of doing both and doing both of them well? I've seen marriages attacked in a variety of ways. You have the obvious things where guys are stupid and they're meeting with women one-on-one, which is just a surefire recipe for disaster. But even far more subtle things like just shelving dates, shelving date night, not pursuing your spouse in a romantic or intentional way. I meant spiritually earlier, but even just as a normal, just as a husband and father, like not being engaged with your wife and caring for her and loving her. Finances. So all the things that contribute to a normal divorce or problems within the family, I think they're just compounded in the kiln of church planting. Nobody gets into church planting to make money. I don't know that you know this, but it's not a terribly lucrative job. And there's a lot of financial strain and a lot of financial pressure. And guys are trying to figure out, like, how do I make the ends meet? How do I fund this church plant while at the same time caring for my family? A lot of guys have a poverty mindset. I'm a church planter and I didn't get into this for the money. And so I'll take the lowest conceivable salary I possibly can because that's somehow more spiritual. And so their family suffers as a result of that. And they get to a place where it's like, we can't afford to stay at this. Like financially, we can't afford to keep doing this. So I've seen that a number of times. But I would say the biggest one, honestly, is just the ignoring of the family couched in spiritual terms. Hey, let me get settled out. Let me get through this season of busyness. And then on the other side of that, everything will go back to normal. And one season becomes 2, and 2 seasons become 3, and 3 seasons become just a pattern of life. So those are some of the things, some of the common ones. Everybody's a little bit different. Every marriage and relationship is a little bit different. I tend to define guys are either trucks or sports cars. You have like the super relational, outgoing, extroverted families who every night of the week they're out doing stuff. They're sports cars. They're constantly on the move, going all the time. And you have other guys who they're trucks and they tend to attract and pull heavy loads. And part of the problem is when a family is wired like a truck, but it's trying to run like a sports car, it'll overheat and the engine will blow up. If a family's wired like a sports car and they're constantly wanting to be on the move, but they keep attracting really heavy loads, they'll burn up their engine because they're pulling a load that's too heavy for them to pull. And so I say that to say, like, guys often neglect to bring others along to help them in the process. One of the reasons that they ignore their family for the sake of the church is because they are unwilling to entrust anything to anybody else. So they're trying to be everything to everybody. Paul says, I'm all things to all people. He didn't mean that you are everything for everybody. He said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes so that I might see people come to saving faith in Jesus. He doesn't mean I attend every single meeting and I am involved in every single ministry and I go to every single thing. And guys tend to neglect leveraging and stewarding what's been entrusted to them and faithful co-laborers around them.
That is a man problem, I feel like, in general. Because that is just huge in the business world. That's huge in all kinds of, if you especially are wired as that sports car, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you will make excuses to, neglect family, neglect just personal responsibilities in order to get farther up the mountain of whichever one you're trying to climb. What I see as the caveat to what you just explained is that you get to wrap it in a spiritual Jesus Bible cloth, and that is a lot harder to criticize. And as a church planner's wife, I could see where that would be so hard to try to interact or try to bring that to your husband's attention, or just as a family. Because yeah, even if you're the kid, you're just like, dad is trying to proclaim the gospel. He's trying to grow a church and save people's souls. Like, everyone would feel guilty of like bringing that back in. And so I see that as a huge pitfall. That's, a scary way to term it.
Yeah, one of the things that we worked on as a family is I would tell our daughter at the time, so she was 8 months old when we planted, but as she got older, if I had a significant meeting that crept up and I did have to go to make a hospital visit or things like that, I would always follow it up very quickly with, but what's really cool is dad gets to coach the soccer team. I get to be done at 3:00 and go coach the soccer team. Isn't it cool that dad's job allows him to be able to do that? We would distinguish church from job. Like, we are going to church as a family. Dad is going to his job on Monday. And so I would try to distinguish between those things. And anytime there was a difficulty associated with planting a church, I would also try to marry that with, there's a cool, unique blessing as well. And I had to walk that out. Like, I couldn't just say that. I had to take the time off at 3:00 to go coach soccer, or to take the random Tuesday off because it's a beautiful day and take her to the zoo, or whatever the case may be. And so one of the things we encourage our guys a lot with is, this is a unique season of ministry. And one of the unique blessings in this season is you don't have a staff of 20 people. You don't have a building that you're overseeing. There's a lot of things you don't have, which means that you ought to have some freedom with your schedule. Make sure that you're using that freedom to bless your family. Anyway.
I want to talk about, you're in a unique situation where you're seeing guys at the ground level building up churches from the start, and then getting maybe people in for the first time, or like, it's exciting. There's a new church in the community, maybe unbelievers that are just interacting with the church for the first time. And I believe here recently, we've been in the seeker-sensitive movement, the larger than life, the fog machines, the lights, and the maybe TED Talks and stuff like that. You're maybe seeing people starting from the ground floor, building anew, and also new people coming in. Do you see those preferences changing of like the bigger, like larger than life entertainment? Do you see that still prevalent? Do you see church planters still wanting to take part in that model? Or do you see kind of people like wanting to strip it back, and people coming in for the first time not wanting that type of church anymore?
For sure. So the pendulum tends to swing. And so when you had churches planted in the 50s and 60s, it tended to be a little bit more high church. They tended to try to get a church with a steeple and do a little bit more like high church. By wear a suit and tie, even in the early days, and it's hymns, and it felt like the large church just scaled down smaller. And then you have kind of the seeker-sensitive movement. And every generation sees the flaws in the one that they grew up in. And so the generation coming up has largely seen, almost exclusively in the large church, the smoke show and the lasers and the big production. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, you see the flaws and the frustrations associated with it. And so now the pendulum is beginning to swing back the other direction. Can we recapture hymnody? Like, instead of singing the 7-Eleven choruses, right? Can we recapture hymnody where there's deep, rich theology? Can we recapture that? Can we recapture a really serious study of the word? Can we swing the pendulum back and make it look a lot more like high church again? And what will happen is the pendulum will swing slowly and inevitably all the way to the far end, and people will grow up in that and say, why can't we be more relatable? And it'll start to swing back again. And that's partially that's not something that we have to fight necessarily. That's just culture. Culture does that, right? Culture, if you look at photos from the 40s, man, people didn't go to the DMV that they didn't wear a suit and tie. They didn't go grocery shopping that they didn't have on a suit and tie. Now you go to Walmart, people are in their pajamas. Like, please, at least be in the pajamas. And so, yeah, church planting is the same way. And you have guys that are embracing that more wholeheartedly. Like right now, they're going hard after high church from jump. And other guys who are, a little less than that, but they're doing what they can. And then you still have guys that are, hey, this is what I have. I've got a guy who's really good at production, and I've got a great worship band. And so they're going to steward that and leverage that and do what they can. So it is definitely a pendulum that is swinging back in the other direction, but it will inevitably get to the far end, and then it'll start to swing back again. You see that in like the worship wars that were 25 years ago of hymns versus contemporary, right? Like I grew up in the era where it was, one service was contemporary and one service was traditional. And I cannot tell you how many people lost their jobs because they were too contemporary or not contemporary enough or whatever. And so the church is always going to have these stages that they're going to be in. And right now it's going to start slowly swinging back more towards traditional high church. You'll hear words like the buzzwords will be authentic, community, real, like all that kind of language is going to kind of resurface again. Smaller, more intimate, that kind of thing. And that's not bad. It's a good thing. As long as it's contextually appropriate, there's nothing wrong with that. Again, I think the problem is when we just mindlessly consume or mindlessly go through the motions of, well, I like contemporary, so let's go like full on contemporary without thinking about but contextually, is that appropriate? Is that going to be helpful? One of our planters is in an urban setting, and somebody was asking him, are you going to try to replicate the large church that you were in downtown? He was like, no. He was like, they have 30 or 40 people involved in their worship ministry. They've got a half a dozen or more people involved in production. They have a huge facility that has to be a well-oiled machine because there's so many parts to it. He said, in my context, man, I'm going to have 50 people. If it was this super well-oiled machine, it would feel really weird. Like I actually want it to feel kind of clunky and awkward at points because then it'll feel like the average person in my community will feel welcome there. And so I applauded him. I was like, that's thinking contextually. Not that you're not giving it your very best, but you're not as worried about it being well-oiled because of the context, not because of laziness or ineptitude.
Context. Contextualization is something that I think is like very important. We've maybe steered a little bit too far into looking like the culture, but I'm curious on how much you train your guys who you're talking to, who you're building up, to know their culture, to know their setting, to know what's going on around their communities, to know what's going on at the large scale in our nation. How much are you telling them that is important for when they're becoming a pastor?
Quite a bit, to be honest with you. But there are differing degrees of importance in contextualization. So if you're planting in a context where half of the people in your community speak Spanish and you don't have anybody in leadership that speaks Spanish, that's a problem. If you're planting in a community where half of the population are working class, blue collar people and everybody on staff lives out of context and lives in well-to-do areas, that's a problem. If you're completely out of touch with the needs and problems and issues that people that live in and around the community where you're planting are facing, that's a problem. So context matters, but context matters to differing degrees. I'm not as concerned with the politics and the what's happening in the news and things like that. While those things matter, it's not as important as knowing your neighbor's name and what kind of things that they're dealing with and facing. It's the difference between, so every one of our planters will get a demographic study for their zip code. So as they're thinking about planting a church, we'll send them a demographic study, and it will tell them all sorts of things. It'll tell them religions in the area and socioeconomic indicators and finances and all these different things. And that's great, but it's very different boots on the ground. And so I was kind of chiding one of our guys the other day. I met him at a coffee shop in his area. And I said, how many times have you and I had coffee in this coffee shop? He was like, I don't know, 6 or 7. I was like, yeah, at least 6 or 7. What's the name of the barista that just served us our coffee? He was like, I don't know. Like, her name is Sarah. Like, do you know anything about Sarah? He was like, no. I was like, that's context with boots on, right? That's context with flesh on. You need to know what's actually happening with the people, not just in a vacuum or on a piece of paper. So we heavily emphasize context, but context that is in proximity and in relationship with people. Practical for sure. You also have, like, if I can say it like this, like kind of more of a micro contextualization. So I have a guy who his intent in the planting in the area where he was to minister to and to reach people who were downtrodden, impoverished, just the forgotten in that area, which is a great intention. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. But 6 months in, I'm looking around the room and I'm like, I don't see any of those people in here. I'm seeing mostly dinks, dual income, no kids, 20-somethings. And I told him, I was like, you have a choice that you have to make. Now, contextually in this area, there's lots of the people that you described. There's also a lot of the people that you're actually reaching. And you can either lean into who it is you're actually reaching and begin to contextualize to them and reach more of them, or you need to lead the group that's actually coming to more effectively contextualize and reach the people that are around you. So there's kind of a micro contextualization as well. Like, who are you actually reaching? You can set out to reach this particular context, but actually more effectively reach this one. And if you never make that adjustment, you actually are going to be ineffective. So there's a little bit of both of those things, but contextualization plays a huge role. It's just the right kind of contextualization.
2 controversial topics to maybe end us off. We'll see where we go. Because we can't talk about church planting and pastoral ministry without talking about 2 things that are like pretty prevalent in this area in America. So, one, you've talked about my guys, men, multiple times. Why is pastoral ministry, the pulpit, lead pastor? Why is that for a man biblically?
Because the Bible says so. I mean, honestly, I think the scriptures are very clear that the role and responsibility of being the head, the leader of the church is an office, and it's an office reserved for men. It's repeated in multiple places, 2 Timothy, Titus. I think 2 errors that I see in this particular topic. One is where churches become so preoccupied with men leading that they neglect to see value in the way that women serve and lead in the context of the church. The office of pastor is reserved for men, but that's it. That's it. In every other facet of the church, and those facets are myriad, women can lead, can serve, and are oftentimes our best leaders and servants in those areas. And sometimes we can become so preoccupied with calling men to lead that we completely neglect to affirm and encourage and train and support women that the Lord has raised up to serve the life of the church as well. And so I think that's a real danger in one ditch. I think the other ditch is allowing what is currently in vogue culturally to dictate how we read the Bible. The Bible is true from cover to cover and has been since its writing and will be forever. And to allow culture to dictate the way we read Scripture is a problem. The way we read Scripture ought to help us to interpret and rightly understand culture, not the other way around. And so I think that's the other ditch in an effort to remain relevant or not be seen on the wrong side of history and all these other catchphrases, right? We will jettison the truth of Scripture, or we'll tweak or modify, or, well, you know what Paul really meant was, anytime somebody starts the sentence that way, it ought to make your ears go up a little bit. So I think those are both ditches that have to be avoided, and we know how we're wired. And so if you grew up in the church, the likelihood is you're more prone to ignore women than to celebrate and encourage and, and raise them up and train them. And if you didn't, you're probably more prone to the other one. But you just have to know how you're wired and recognize, I don't want to fall into that ditch. And there's a whole myriad of other things that could be said on that topic. But
would you consider the pastor and the elder the same position, out of curiosity?
I would. They're used interchangeably in the New Testament. I think at times we get a little too cute with our verbal and linguistic gymnastics. It's a children's pastor if it's a guy. It's a children's director if it's a woman. Like, I think at times, like, we play games with terminology, and I would urge church, be very careful with that. Make sure you're explaining, like, hey, he's a pastor. He's the children's pastor, and here's what we mean by that. She's the children's director. Here's why she's a director, not a pastor. Like, I think those things need to be explained and not left open to interpretation.
I think it's called chronological snobbery, where we look back on history and we're just like, they didn't have it right. But it's like when you figure out in the church, you're maybe doing some of the first things that's ever been done in 2,000 years of New Testament church, that you might be veering into something that's not correct, and you might be following.
It's a very strong likelihood that if it's never been done before, you might be in some dangerous waters.
But the culture's pressure to, and I think you hit on it perfectly, of that we haven't figured out in maybe the more conservative part of American Protestant church, how to lovingly build up women who probably are much better at some stuff than men, and how to like really let them flourish in those positions while also not crossing over to the cultural pressures of giving that, like, they can't teach or they can't lead. And it's like, no, it's just like, this is the way the church is structured, and that's okay. But there are boundaries in which the Lord gives us, and that we might figure out on the other side of heaven why it's all structured exactly the way that He wanted it to be. But we are just we are commanded to follow it. That's it. And each generation has had different things that it's had to focus on. And I would say that LGBTQ and women's rights are just like the things that this church still has to stick to. The Bible still says what it says about those things.
Well, and we have to be careful that we can communicate the truth in love. I tell you, Tim Keller was masterful at this, of being able to convey what culture sees and seeing value in aspects of it while providing the corrective lens of Scripture. I've read many, I won't say all because I'm sure there's something out there I haven't, but most of Keller's stuff, I've heard him preach many times. I don't know that I've ever heard him use negative or pejorative language to describe culture or people who adhere to culture. He always managed to find a way to honor them and to see value in aspects of what they believe or do, while at the same time saying, okay, but if you hold to that position, the Scriptures actually provide this corrective. And here's what this corrective actually does for you. Here's how it blesses you. And I think he just did a masterful job of truth and love at the same time as it relates specifically to culture. I think as pastors and planters in particular, going into unique contexts where, Lord willing, they're seeing the lost come, have to learn to balance truth and love. And again, we tend to be on one side or the other. They're all love and they're very hesitant to bring truth to bear, or they're all truth and they're seen as angry and unloving. And you've got to kind of figure out, like, again, how are you wired, and bring both sides to the table, not just one.
I don't expect you to have a ton of, experience with this model, but I'm curious to hear if you have any thoughts. But the satellite campus with the screen, what do you think? It could be personal preference. It could be biblical if you've thought about it, like, theologically. But I'm just curious because this is probably the predominant church plant model at the moment. If I had to guess, bigger churches that are taking on almost whole states and saying, we are going to plant everywhere throughout the state, and it's going to be a satellite campus with still the same name and a screen. And so it is like the dominant church model going forward. And so I'm just curious to see how much you've thought about it.
Yeah, and I think COVID, where we got kind of used to, in a lot of ways, watching the preaching on the screen, kind of has made that accelerate a little bit in some areas. Man, I think you're not gonna like my answer. I think it depends on your motivation and how and why you're going about it. I don't think there's anything wrong with leveraging technology for the sake of the advance of the gospel. I think if your motivation is to franchise the church and to elevate a particular speaker or person, I think that becomes increasingly problematic. We gather to worship Jesus, not worship a keynote speaker. And so if the emphasis is on, we want our brand to continue to grow and we want this speaker to continue to have a higher level of platform, I think that's problematic. I think it's problematic if you have a screen, but you have no actual shepherds on the ground. I think that's a huge problem. A friend of mine was a campus pastor, and I have learned it's a little bit like Calvinism. Like I've learned, like, all right, define your term. Like somebody asks me if I'm a Calvinist, I'm like, okay, define what you mean by that. Ask me the theological question. Don't ask me the terminology question. And so he's a campus pastor, and I said, well, what does campus pastor mean in your context? And he's like, well, I'm basically an announcement monkey. I get up, I make some announcements, and then I hit play. And I was like, okay, that's a problem. That's a problem. That's not a shepherd. That's production. And production might be great, but a church without a shepherd is a problem. I mean, going back to our original conversation, the irreducible ecclesiological minimum, there ought to be a shepherd on the ground to shepherd the sheep. And so I don't have a problem with leveraging technology. I certainly think in certain contexts, planting in rural contexts, it's increasingly hard to find the infrastructure that makes it possible for a guy to live in a rural context and be able to raise a family and pastor a church in a rural setting. So if you told me like, hey, there's a church that's going to get a service started and initially they're going to use screens until they're able to find and bring somebody, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that at all. So I think a lot of it honestly comes back to like, what are your motivations? Have you thought through your ecclesiology on the topic, or are you just doing this because we want to expand the brand? And sadly, there are churches that want to expand the brand. I wish that wasn't the case, but there are. And there are preachers and teachers who want to expand their platform and their brand. And I wish that wasn't the case. Having said that, I would be very hesitant to make an assumption that any church that's doing that's their motivation. I would want, if our church did that, I would want to be able to have the opportunity to explain why. Here's why we're doing that. Here's why we think it's necessary. So I think the campus thing, I think that's, I would agree with you, that's growing incredibly quickly right now as a strategy. I think the video thing it remains to be seen. I think it's very interesting. But I think the motivation matters a tremendous amount.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about when it comes to church planting, the Big C Church here in America, or even in Indiana, if you want to be more contextual, but anything that we didn't talk about that you think would be helpful?
So two things that I think that I'm seeing on a regular basis that I would highlight. One is the rise and need for immigrant church planting. The nations are here. Immigration is a topic, obviously, in our world today, in politics for sure. But when we look around our city, there are tons of people groups that are here who do not have the ability to gather and worship in their heart language. And so there is a tremendous need to plant faithful, Christ-exalting, Bible-believing churches in their language. So, for instance, like right now, I'm working with a church planter who is ministering to Swahili-speaking peoples. I'm working with another who is working with Punjabi Indians. I'm working with another who is planting a deaf church. There's all of these different people groups that are all around. Burmese, Hispanic. And then in Hispanic, just as a side note, not everybody that speaks Spanish worships in the same way. There's a difference between Guatemalans and Mexicans and Chileans, or whatever, Costa Ricans. So there's this tremendous need to plant immigrant churches. Related to that, though, is the second generation. So you have immigrant church planting. People have moved here from Costa Rica. They plant a church. The kids that are growing up here they're growing up where English is the language they predominantly speak. They're growing up in the American school systems. Their music that they listen to is predominantly American music, things like that. However, they also have a very strong tie to their cultural heritage. And so you're finding right now that there's a growing need for either second-gen church planting or immigrant churches that are embracing the second generation that's coming up. So it's a really fascinating thing happening in the world of church planting, and how are we navigating those waters? So I find that, first of all, I find immigrant church planting to be a fascinating arena, and tremendous opportunity, because a lot of these nations where we can plant churches here are nations where we might not be able to send missionaries very readily. And so it's a really cool opportunity that we have if we take advantage of it. The second thing I find really interesting in the world of church planting is how tribal we can be in the world of church planting. We're very quick to find our network or our tribe or our people or whatever. And at times we lose sight of the fact, you said earlier, like, we're on the same team. I want to see faithful, Christ-exalting churches planted in our city. Do I want to have a particular role? And do I want the network that I serve and am a part of to have a unique? Absolutely, I do. I'm a part of it for a reason. I love it. I believe in it. But I am super excited. I met with a church the other day, and they're planting in a neighboring community. I couldn't be more thrilled that they're planting in this community. They're going to do an awesome job. And I couldn't be more excited. And I'll do everything in my power to be a help to them. And at times, I think if we want to see a real move of God, we're going to have to look across the aisle, so to speak, and look at one another and say, hey, we might not agree on this particular point of theology or ecclesiology, but we serve the same King Jesus, and him we proclaim together. And so let's lock arms, and you plant churches and we'll plant churches, but let's bear in mind that we're part of the same kingdom and we're on the same team, and we ultimately want to see the same thing happen. We want to see people come to know, love, and serve King Jesus. And so I'm excited about immigrant church planting. I'm desiring to see a greater level of kingdom collaboration. Denominations exist for a reason. We have convictions about these different points of ecclesiology or theology. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's actually helpful in a lot of ways. But where we allow those things to create walls and barriers that don't allow us to collaborate together at all, I think that's problematic. So I just want to see greater kingdom collaboration, because the nations are here, and I just want to see us plant and see people reached from every tribe, tongue, and nation, man. So, yeah.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much. Thank you for your work. I get to see it personally. You're in my community, and I just really appreciate someone who's taken the front line. There's this speech I love called "Man in the Arena." It's one of my favorites, and it's just I look up so much to people who are putting themselves in the line of fire, and it's one of the biggest callings. This is what Jesus died for, is his church, his bride. And so thank you for encouraging these pastors. Hopefully people will be encouraged by this, and that we get more and more people that are willing to step up to the calling. We need churches more than ever. So
For sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
thanks, Scott.